Welcome everyone. Glad to see you on my channel. Today I will tell you about an unusual story, an amazing story about companionship and love. I wish you a pleasant audience.
Julia remained the only one in their entire sorority who didn't have a husband. Leslie didn't count. She was only 19 and wasn't going to get married in the next 5 years. She flirted with men, seduced them, and laughingly turned them down. Julia was already 25 and she wanted to get married, but all her attempts to marry another suitor ended in failure. It would seem that she was good and smart and economic and not a bad position, but something that repelled men from her. As soon as Julia began to plan a more serious relationship, another suitor evaporated. She and Harry met at work. He and his father were renovating premises, and in the office where Julia worked, just decided to make repairs. It was Leslie's birthday that day. After the workday, she had a banquet for her co-workers. Harry and his father were also invited. When the more family-oriented colleagues started to go home, it was decided to continue the celebration at the club. Harry agreed to go with the girls. From that day on, Julia and Harry began dating. The young man wooed beautifully, did not skimp on gifts and trips to restaurants, theaters, and clubs. Did not insist on intimacy, but also the desire to become a family man did not show. After 6 months of platonic relations, Julia got worried. They met almost every day, but they never went further than kissing when saying goodbye. And there was no proposal to speak of. Julia's birthday was approaching. Having consulted with her aunt, where she lived, Julia was from a small village in the neighboring region. We decided that I would celebrate her birthday with my family, at home. If he dares to meet us, it means that he is still serious and we just need to push him, confidently said the aunt, who also already worried about the unmarried fate of her niece. Julia was afraid that Harry would refuse to come, but to her surprise and joy he agreed, and he even came, with 2 bouquets of flowers, one for Julia and one for her aunt, and an expensive present for Julia. Either Harry had had a little too much to drink that evening, or Julia's aunt had carefully convinced him that he was almost related to them and that their wedding was not far off. But that evening, Julia and Harry became close. But it didn't change Harry's attitude toward Julia. He was still polite, attentive, and generous, but he did not show the passion and mad love Julia dreamed of. To put her hand on her heart, Julia could not boast of such feelings either. She also felt nothing but sympathy and respect for Harry. But she was already 26 years old, and she hadn't gotten her passport stamped. "Harry, I need to tell you something," Julia began hesitantly as they sat in his car. Harry brought her home after the movie and was about to say goodbye, but the girl beat him to it. "I'm pregnant." It didn't seem to surprise him. He looked at Julia carefully and asked, "Why didn't you consult me? Why did you decide alone that a child was necessary?" "I didn't decide." Julia's heart fell. She stopped using birth control at her own risk without telling Harry. That's what her aunt told her to do. "Well, throw those pills away and start getting pregnant," she told her firmly, "or you'll never get a proposal from him." "And if he refuses?" Julia asked fearfully. "It's not a big deal. You will get in front of him pregnant. Photos in social networks. You will show with a belly, and you'll see, and conscience will rise up. If it doesn't work out, you'll give birth and we'll arrange for the baby to fall into his hands. Then he won't resist. Mine also ran away from me, and as soon as I took Colca in my arms and disappeared. I was still shameless later. I didn't agree to marry him." "And if you cannot learn?" Sadly looking at the aunt, asked the girl. "Then you will be a single mother." "It's better than an old maid," said the aunt. "It's just, maybe there was a faulty batch of pills. So we'll have the baby," Harry said calmly and got out of the car. He walked around the car and helped Julia out. Then he kissed her and said, "See you tomorrow." The girl stayed up all night. The next day was a day off, and to distract herself from her sad and anxious thoughts, she started cleaning. Harry hadn't called all day. In the evening, when the whole family was watching television with Julia, the doorbell rang. On the threshold stood Harry, his father, and a woman, apparently the young man's mother. "You've got the goods. We got the merchant," Harry's father shouted cheerfully, and his mother, pursing her lips, walked into the apartment. After the wedding, the young people settled with Harry's parents. While Julia was working, she had not yet noticed how her husband's mother treated her. But when she went on maternity leave, all the charms of life with a non-working mother-in-law piled on the young woman that constantly nagged her about anything from wrong, in her opinion, cooking, to the appearance. Harry and his father disappeared late at work, and then her husband began to go out after work to rest. Julia practically stopped seeing her husband. She was very hurt and lonely. To keep herself busy, she took long walks, coming home only in the evening and locking herself in her and her husband's room. Julia got out of bed and went to the window. As luck would have it, the streetlight beneath her window was not lit. From the 12th floor, it was hard to see what was going on down there in the darkness. Julia went back to bed. The last few months of her pregnancy had been plagued by insomnia. She wanted to go to the kitchen and get some tea, but she couldn't afford it. The first time she did, her disgruntled mother-in-law, Ariana, came out of her room and reprimanded her for walking around the apartment at night. "What are you doing up? Are you waiting for Harry? Why? For a fight? He'll be back. He's not going anywhere. He's got a hard job. He's got to rest. And here you are with your scandals." I didn't intend to. Julia was surprised by such conclusions. I just couldn't sleep and decided to have some tea. "What tea in the middle of the night? Especially for you. Why does the baby need extra water? You should be sleeping at night, not drinking tea. Think of the baby. Go to bed. You'll be drinking tea in the morning." A sleepy father-in-law appeared in the kitchen. He was the only one who treated Julia kindly. "Why are you shouting, Ariana?" he asked his wife. "It's just wandering around, keeping me awake. She wants to drink tea in the middle of the night. So what? Don't you want water? You said that too. You don't care about feeding her, but you don't care about water. I feel sorry for the baby. Torturing him with her walks. I feel sorry for you. What's wrong with me? So I woke you up. You have to go to work early. It wasn't Julia who woke me up. It was your screaming. Now that you're up, I'll have some tea. Come on, Julia." Julia, ready to cry, nodded, smiling wearily. Ariana, her lips pressed together in displeasure, retired to her bedroom. Anthony boiled the kettle, set out the cups. "Isn't that brat here yet?" he asked when they were sitting down to drink tea. "No," Julia replied. "He had to go to work tomorrow." Julia was glad to have an advocate in someone else's house, but she tried to stay in her room at night. With the birth of Mickey, Ariana literally kept up with Julia every minute. "How do you swaddle him? How do you feed him? He has to eat every 3 hours. Get him on a schedule from the time he's a baby. Let him cry. He needs to know he's on a schedule. Why are you changing his diaper? A diaper is designed to last 6 hours. Let the baby get used to peeing after sleeping and eating. Are you sleeping? What kind of rest? You have to make the most of your time while the baby sleeps. Go do the laundry. How does the machine wash everything? You're crazy. Baby's clothes should only be washed by hand and only with baby soap. And ironing. Have you ironed everything? Have you sterilized bottles and nipples? They need to be boiled every time you give them to your baby." After a couple of months of this kind of control, Julia was barely on her feet. After waiting for her husband to come home from work one evening, she called him in for a serious talk. "Well, Julia, Mommy just wants to help." Harry resisted tiredly. He had completely withdrawn from his son's upbringing, except for his maintenance. If she wants to help, then let her help, not give advice. "I can't even wash in peace while the baby sleeps. She's always making me do things. I'm tired. I want to rest. But even when Mickey's asleep at night, I can't do anything for myself. You see, I wake her up by moving around the apartment. It's like a prison in here." "Julia, don't exaggerate." "I'm not exaggerating. Either we move out of here or I take Mickey and do it myself. But I don't want to live with your mom anymore. If we don't move out tomorrow, I won't be here after tomorrow." "All right, I'll think of something." Harry was very sleepy. The next day, Julia never waited for her husband. She spent the whole day packing to the ridicule of her mother-in-law. "Where are you going? Harry will never move out of his mother's house. He's got comfort and nutrition here. What can you give him? With me keeping him cozy and cooking, I don't think he'll notice the change." Julia snapped at him. She didn't care what Ariana thought of her anymore. After not waiting for her husband all day, Julia called her on. "I can't take it anymore. Help me with a place to live." My neighbor is going to Germany to live in Germany. His apartment is small. He does not want to sell, but he's afraid to rent. I'll ask. Maybe he'll let you in." Julia, inspired, hung up the phone and looked triumphantly at her mother-in-law, who was present during the conversation. She snorted and, with her lips pressed together as usual, retreated to her room. Harry arrived well past midnight. When Julia asked him about moving, he waved her off. "Julia, give me a break. What about moving? Why don't you live? You have everything. You do not need anything. What's the big deal? And anyway, I have to get up early. Let me sleep." In the morning, Julia called a cab and drove to her aunt's house to Ariana's screams. Everything worked out just fine. Auntie's neighbor allowed Julia to live in his apartment, and the young woman, leaving the child to her aunt, began to make the new place cozy. For the first time in months, Julia allowed herself to lie in the bathtub and brush her hair. The caring aunt didn't bother her until Julia herself came to her apartment to pick up Mickey. They sat in the kitchen, drinking tea and talking. Julia talked about the last few months of her life with her mother-in-law. Auntie sighed and sighed. Mickey blew bubbles and mumbled in his baby language. Suddenly, Julia realized that she didn't miss her husband at all. She didn't care whether he continued to live with her or not. When she went to her new place, she put the baby to bed and went to bed herself. To her surprise, she and Mickey slept through the night without waking up. In the morning, the doorbell rang. A crumpled, red-eyed Harry stood on the doorstep with a bouquet of flowers and a suitcase. "Julia, I'm so sorry. I heard so much about you from my mother yesterday that I realized how terrible it was for you to live like that. I mean, she never worked a day in her life. My sister and I were taken care of by anyone but her, but teaching life was her specialty. Her sister, when she was 18, ran away from home and jumped out of the house and married and moved up north with her husband. There was a new period in Julia's family life. Harry no longer stayed late from work. He began to help Julia around the house and spend more time with his son. Even the relationship between the couple became more tender. Julia every day more and more fell in love with her spouse, and he answered her in the same way. The young family began to save money for their own place. As soon as Mickey was put in kindergarten, Julia went to work. She was immediately offered a higher position, but with one condition. She would receive another education, more suitable for the position of a manager. The woman gladly accepted. Her husband gave her another surprise and decided to give her a car. Julia went to a driving course. The woman was in a hurry to get home. Today, she and her husband had a romantic dinner at a restaurant. Julia had recently passed all the exams at the driving school and got her license today. At the restaurant, the woman had to present her husband with a new document, and Harry solemnly handed her the keys to a new car. The car was already standing in the yard, and Julia even sat in it a few times, but the trip in her own car was scheduled for tomorrow. Julia took her son to his aunt's house and started packing. She had bought a new dress for this dinner, and it was going to blow Harry away. She wanted to show him how she really felt about him, how much she loved and appreciated him, and desires. At the appointed time, Harry didn't show up. Julia dialed his number several times, but the phone was out of range. She sat up until the morning in a new dress. With hair and makeup, Harry never showed up. In the morning, the doorbell rang. Julia went on stiff legs to open it. Anthony stood on the doorstep. "Julia, be strong." The car was registered to Anthony. In the first hours after the terrible accident, which left only a pile of crumpled iron, it was assumed that the owner of the car was inside. Ariana looked at her husband with the telephone receiver and terror in her eyes. "Anthony, I was just told that you were in an accident and you're dead." "Where?" "On the straight." Anthony rushed to get dressed. Ariana, with surprising speed for her, rushed after him. "Anthony, what does this mean?" she wailed on the way. "Anthony, say something." When they arrived at the scene of the accident, the body was already being loaded into a special truck. Anthony remembered the rest of it only in fragments. The policeman's story about how the car, which was driven by his son, at high speed hit a drunk driver who flew out of the oncoming. Ariana's hysteria, the cold room of the morgue, the bloody body of his son, the wife's hysteria again. A lot of people in white coats and voices. Are you all right? How can I be okay when I just lost my only son? Shall I give you an injection? Your wife collapsed. We took her to the ward. Toward morning, he woke up. We have to tell Julia. Maybe she already knows. If she knew, she'd be here. Anthony talked to himself, rising from the hospital bench. He walked into Ariana's room. She was asleep under the influence of the drugs. Without being stopped by anyone, walked out of the hospital building, caught a cab, gave Julia's address. Julia was crying silently. Having sobbed all day and all night, she had no strength left for anything, but the tears were pouring down her cheeks. Her newly acquired happiness collapsed like a house of cards. From time to time, her aunt looked into her apartment, calming her down, giving her water and sedatives. Finally, she called a nurse she knew and she gave Julia a shot, after which she fell asleep. It was a year after Harry's death. In order not to lose her mind, Julia completely immersed herself in work and the upbringing of her son. She was actively helped by her aunt. Mother-in-law and father-in-law forgot about the existence of the grandson. And if this behavior of Ariana Julia was not surprised, then Anthony's unwillingness to communicate with his only grandson was offensive to her. She even tried to talk to him on the phone. Each time the phone was picked up by her mother-in-law and shouted angrily, "Leave us alone. We don't owe you anything." Once Julia even tried to meet Anthony in person. She arrived at their house and sat on the bench at the entrance, waiting for him to come out. And he did. But as soon as the man saw her, he immediately pressed his lips together like his spouse and coldly threw, "We have nothing to talk to you about." After that, Julia gave up all attempts to get her son back from his grandfather. In time, the woman's wound healed and she began to need the attention of men again. Mickey was already in the 3rd grade and was quite an independent boy. Her aunt was still happy to help her and insisted on resuming her love life and finding a husband. Julia looked at the men around her, evaluated, and even went on dates a couple times, but none could not make her heart beat faster. Already desperate, she decided to get a man for health. Soon the case presented itself. At one of the corporate events, Julia noticed a tall, imposing man with a slight gray hair on his temples and a confident look in his gray eyes. She tried to see him as inconspicuously as possible, but he noticed her attention and raised his glass in greeting. Julia smiled broadly in return and then looked away. Don't let him think he was interested in her. But with the first slow song she heard above her ear, "Do you dance?" The voice was so soft, enveloping, and promising unearthly pleasures that Julia did not hesitate to turn around and said yes. The man introduced himself as Archie and showered Julia with compliments throughout the dance. When the dance was over, he kissed her hand and escorted her to the bar. "I hope to see you again." His velvet voice gave her no chance to say no. Married, Leslie's voice brought Julia out of her daze and she looked at her colleague. "This is our new head of the legal department," continued her friend. "He's a classy guy. Too bad he's married." "I don't care. I'm not going to baptize my children with him," Julia said, trying not to show how upset she was by the news. After the weekend that followed the corporate party, Julia found a small but very beautiful bouquet of flowers with a note. "To the most enchanting dance partner." The woman smiled and put the bouquet in water. The next day, the situation with the bouquet was repeated. During the whole week, a small bouquet appeared on Julia's desk in the morning, but without notes. The last bouquet contained a small heart-shaped card with only one word: lunch. Normally, Julia didn't go out to lunch, limiting herself to the food she brought from home, which she ate in the office. But here curiosity got the better of her. What did this handsome married man want from her? Just to have fun, or is it really a big and pure feeling, which is not subject to public opinion, morals, and obligations? As soon as the hands on the clock struck 12, Julia got up from her desk, threw on her coat, and walked leisurely out of the office. She hadn't expected to lose her head like this in her 35 years. Just one lunch together and Julia was gone. His eyes caressed her entire body. His voice enveloped her and made her forget everything. "I never thought I could ever lose my head to love a woman again," Archie had whispered passionately to her on their first date, which was the same day after their first lunch together. Julia had come home from work that day and stood in front of the mirror for a long time, examining herself from head to toe. What are you hoping for? She asked herself. He's married, he has a family, and even if he feels something for you, it's only temporary. Come to your senses, use your head. But her head wouldn't turn on. All Julia could think about was Archie. If Mickey were home, he'd take her mind off her vicious thoughts. But the son had gone to a friend's house for the night, leaving his mother alone with her forbidden feelings. Julia sat in her room without changing into her homemade costume. Her memory was tucking away memories of today's dinner. They talked about distracted topics, but his eyes had said something else, and Julia suspected, to her shame, that she herself was looking at Archie like a fool in love. And when Archie touched her lightly on the way out of the restaurant, Julia felt an electric shock and a fiery mixture in her stomach, as if she'd been drinking alcohol. The doorbell rang. Mickey, the woman rejoiced and rushed to open it, but on the doorstep stood Archie with a huge bouquet of scarlet roses and a supermarket bag. Archie, what are we doing? Julia tried to get out of bed, but the man pulled her to him. Trying to be happy, he kissed the top of her head. Aren't you happy with your wife? The feelings we once had for each other are long gone. We live for our daughter, and because we haven't met anyone we can leave our family for. At least not my wife. And you? Julia mentally scolded herself for asking, but she couldn't help asking. Archie raised himself up on his elbow and looked Julia straight in the eye. The night I saw you, I thought I was in a fairy tale. Until then, I never thought I'd ever fall in love like that, like a boy. I lost my head. All I could think about was you. All week I've been telling myself not to dream about you, but I can't. So I decided to take you to dinner and see if I had a chance. What did you determine? His penetrating gaze made Julia stutter slightly. Archie stroked her head, kissed her long and tenderly, and finally answered, that I simply had to find you and kiss you until you agreed to be my sweetheart. No one knew of their liaison, except for their aunt. At work, they behaved in an emphatically polite manner. Only sometimes, when they found themselves alone in the stairwell or in the elevator, or in the office of one of them, they snatched seconds of tenderness. Their meetings were regular, though not as frequent as they would have liked. Archie didn't want to offend his wife's feelings by openly cheating on her. All family traditions he strictly observed, whether it was Sunday dinner, shopping with his wife, a trip to the cottage, or to his mother-in-law. I don't want my daughter to suspect anything. She is a girl I have an impressionable, and the news that I love another woman, it can strongly undermine her. And then there's trouble, and I want her to quietly graduate from the institute and get a decent job. Or better yet, get married. Then she won't have to worry about daddy's feelings. Julia knew he was right, and that in her situation it was better to wait and wait. If she was lucky enough to fall in love and get involved with a married man, but her aunt didn't share her position. Julia, are you out of your mind? If a man wants to leave his family, he leaves. And no one can prevent him from doing so, neither his wife nor his children, no matter how old they are. He has already indicated that for the next few years your status as mistress will not change. And then, if he's still attracted to you, he'll think of something else. From his wife's terminal illness to helping his grandchildren. Leave him before it's too late. Find yourself a free man. Their affair was in its 4th year. Archie's daughter was graduating this year, and Julia hoped that soon he would be hers alone. Archie dreamed of it himself. There was only a little bit left, just a little bit of patience, and that's it, and we'll be happy. In connection with final exams and the defense of his diploma, Archie began to visit Julia less often. You see, darling, she needs support now more than ever. I just have to be there for her. Julia understood and more often sat alone and sat in the evenings. Her son disappeared with his friends in sports clubs and theater studio at school. He came home only to spend the night. And when does he have time for everything? Thought Julia, looking at her sleeping son. Their small apartment did not allow mother and son to have private spaces. The woman began to think about buying her own, more spacious apartment. She would have done so long ago if it hadn't been for Archie. She wanted them to choose their future family nest together and furnish it together. Be patient, son. Soon you'll have your own room and you'll be able to not only sleep over at your friends' houses, but invite them over too. Just a little more. Hey, Leslie came into the office. What are you doing this weekend? Julia looked at her watch. Lunch. Today was not their day. Archie had lunch with his daughter. I don't know yet. Julia shrugged and turned on the kettle to make herself a coffee and a snack. Archie hadn't yet said whether he could come up to see her on his day off. For a moment, the woman had the thought that for the past few years her whole life had been adjusted to meet her lover. Why? Why don't we go clubbing? Leslie nimbly reached into Julia's nightstand and pulled out another cup and reached for a can of coffee. Leslie, what are you doing? How old are we? Julia was surprised. 150. Julie, what does age have to do with it? We're not exactly old and infirm. Let's go to a decent one, without minors. Leslie grabbed one of Julia's sandwiches out of the container and took a greedy bite. I'm sorry for the impudence. I overslept today, so I didn't have time to pack anything. I don't want to spend money on a cafeteria. Besides, I'm going to a club. So what's up? Shall we go? Okay, but I'll check with my friends first. If they have no plans for my weekend, Julia smiled. Check. Leslie smiled too. Her cheerful nature infected others with optimism. Go for a few years married. Leslie divorced, explaining it as follows. Well, not mine is a man to take care of a man. Freeing herself from the shackles of marriage, she again began to flutter and make eyes at the surrounding men. But it was worth another suitor to mention the wedding. Leslie gave him a turn away from the gate. Julia envied such independence and from time to time asked herself, why can't she live the same way? Why couldn't she treat men the same way? Easy, fun, carefree. Did you hear? After a short silence, formed by eating a sandwich, again Leslie crackled. Our head of the legal department, that handsome man, has had an affair with his secretary. Julia was speechless. She stared at her friend. Taking it in her own way, Leslie continued. Can you imagine a girl in her 20s? No sooner had she settled down than she's rounded up our unflappable handsome man. They say he even filed for divorce. But he has a daughter, Julia whispered. To you. When did children keep men? Moreover, his daughter is already an adult, graduates from college. She does not give a damn about her father. She's got her own life. Apparently, something changed in her face. Leslie suddenly abruptly stopped talking and then worriedly shrieked. Julia, are you all right? You're so pale. Julia tried to pull herself together. Yes, I'll take a pill for my blood pressure. I had coffee instead of yogurt. You're talking to me. I was already over my coffee limit for the day. I didn't know you had blood pressure. Well, I'm not so old that I have to talk about my diseases on every corner. Julia answered as cheerfully as possible. After Leslie had left, Julia dialed Archie's number. Archie wasn't alone by the sound of his voice. Archie, I need to talk to you right away. Now. Something in her voice must have startled the man, and he answered hastily. Okay, I'll be there in a few minutes. Those few minutes seemed like years to Julia. She tried to calm down and pull herself together. Let her not think that she was hurt by such gossip. It was nothing more than gossip. Archie flew into her office with a worried look. He threw a stack of papers on the desk, apparently taken as a diversion in front of his co-workers, and sat down across from Julia. Julia, what's wrong? Is it true that you're having an affair with your secretary and you're getting a divorce? The woman tried to speak calmly, without emotion. It would have been fair of you to let me know first. Julia, what are you talking about? Archie started, but Julia interrupted him. I realize that our relationship is in the strictest confidence, and from your adulteries I will not suffer in any way. But still, I have a right to know that I've been abandoned. Okay, I'll tell you. Yes, it's true. I've fallen in love with someone else and plan to marry her. I didn't tell you because I didn't want a scandal. You mean you slept with me and were afraid of a scandal? Julia was suddenly enveloped in an icy calm. Yes, you women always throw tantrums when you're dumped. My wife was screaming so hard I thought the windows were going to blow out. I'm not your wife. Luckily, tantrums aren't my thing. Julia leaned back in her chair. Okay, I hear you. You could have told me all this yourself. Consider it over. What do you mean, broken up? Archie stared at Julia as if he'd just seen her. What were you planning? Divorce? marry someone younger, and I'd still be your mistress. No, I'm sorry, I have other plans. A phone call saved her from further conversation. Sorry, the general is calling. She pointed with her hand to the door. The rest of the day, Julia spent on automatic, talking to her co-workers, answering the phone, doing her job. Her heart seemed to freeze. It wasn't until she got home as she let out a tear. She cried all night. In the morning, her face looked like Julia had slept in a beehive. She couldn't go to work like that. She called in sick to work. Luckily, she and her co-workers were allowed to take a couple of days off like this a year. Julia drew herself a tub of hot water and was about to lie down in it when a sudden dizziness made her grab the wall. Yes, nerves are a serious thing after all, thought the woman, and sat down on the edge of the tub. Her head was still spinning. Canceling the bath, Julia walked to her room and got into bed. Dialed her aunt's number. I think I have pressure. A few minutes later, the auntie with the tonometer was fussing with Julia. Slightly low, but not critical, she wondered. Maybe you ate or drank something wrong. Why is your face so puffy? Julia told me everything. I warned you, began the aunt, but when she saw tears in her niece's eyes, she lowered her tone. All right, there's no need to grieve for that dog now. You're still young. You'll find someone else. That's it. Enough. I'll live for myself and my son. No more men. Julia exclaimed and sobbed again. The next day, Julia got worse. The worried aunt called the doctor. I would recommend you to be examined, the doctor said glumly, filling out a card. Without tests, it is difficult to determine what has happened to you. It may well be a banal fatigue or symptoms of a more bad disease. Well, my dear, the elderly woman doctor smiled maternally at Julia. You are almost all right. The test did not reveal anything serious. What did they find that wasn't serious? Julia asked worriedly. Well, it's not that serious. It's serious, but it's not about your health. You're talking in riddles. Julia was angry. You're having a baby, the doctor announced cheerfully. Now you must be more attentive to your health. Yes, that's great. Julia started to laugh. The doctor interpreted her laughter in her own way and began to issue all kinds of referrals and prescriptions, at the same time explaining what Julia should do now, how to monitor her health and diet. From the doctor, the woman was coming out on the verge of hysteria. The baby, her, an old, abandoned woman with limited housing. She was suddenly thirsty. Julia reached the car and sat down in it, thinking, what will she say to her son? How will her co-workers react to her situation? How will she raise a child in a small apartment? Would she? Absolutely. Abortion. And there's no need to explain anything to anyone. Are you mad? Her aunt's face flushed so red that Julia feared for her health. What abortion? What's the child's fault? But how did I? Alone, in a small apartment. Julia tried to explain the impossibility of having another child. How? First of all, you're not alone. You have me and Mickey. He's already a big and independent guy. He'll help you out if you need it. You earn good money, so you won't starve. And the apartment. You were going to take out a mortgage, weren't you? Here, it's about time. You'll have time to renovate it before you give birth. Julia looked at her aunt carefully. How lucky she was to have her. She was right. It's not the child's fault that the mother's negligent, and he has a right to life. And if the mother also reconsidered her attitude to men, then everything will be fine. The three of them will do just fine. You're right, she said to her aunt. Tomorrow I'll go to the bank, find out how much I have saved and start looking for a suitable apartment. There was a decent amount in the bank. Ever since she and Harry had decided to save for a place to live, Julia had made a habit of topping up the account every month. With the death of her husband, she forgot about the new apartment, but the account continued to replenish. Thanks to this, the woman now had more than enough for a down payment. Julia started looking for an apartment. From her little sick leave, Julia returned to work completely transformed. Now in front of colleagues and subordinates stood not only a good specialist and strict manager, but also a beautiful, well-groomed and stylish woman, dazzling with her, until then quite rare smile. She's in love, whispered her colleagues behind her back. A man has finally appeared, discussed subordinates. You're unrecognizable. Leslie flew into Julia's office. Come on, did you meet someone? Better. Julia smiled. I'm expecting a baby. Come on. Leslie, stunned by the news, slumped in her chair. With who? It doesn't matter. He's gone. Dead. Leslie's voice became a loud whisper. Julia waved her hands and told the story she had prepared for such an occasion. It's just that a few months ago, I met a foreigner. We had a short but very beautiful and happy affair. And the other day I found out that I am going to have a child from this beautiful affair. I am very happy that my last love has borne fruit that will remind me of that happy time. So you didn't tell him? Leslie stared. No. I'm sure he's a decent man and probably would have come to me right away to start a family. But the thing is, I don't want to get married. I don't want this routine because I'm not sure that our life together will be as happy and cloudless as our romance. Leslie's voice is back to a whisper. Why didn't I think of that before? To give birth to a child from the most beautiful novel and live for himself and him. You don't have to get married to do that. Julia, you're a genius. But let's not tell anyone yet. We will tell when it will be impossible to hide. Julia looked at her friend seriously. Of course, I'm a tomb. Leslie ran out of the office. At home that evening, Julia looked through the apartment listings. Mickey, for the first time in many months, was home to help his mother with the selection. When Julia informed him that he would soon have a brother or sister, her son delighted her with his reaction. Great, you and I are all alone, not counting Grandma, your aunt. I was all worried that in a few years I will be forced to leave you to live independently, and you will be alone. And now you'll have another child. Julia stroked her son's head. Thank you, sweetheart. The doorbell rang. Who would it be so late? Wondered Julia, and after a glance with Mickey, went to open it. Anthony stood on the doorstep. Hello, Julia. Can I come in? Yes, of course, come in. The man took off his shoes and walked into the room. He sat on the edge of a chair and stared at the floor, nervously rubbing his cap. Julia and Mickey sat opposite, waiting to see what he would say. Julia, I'm sorry. For all these years. And you, Mickey, I'm sorry. Anthony was silent again. So you're my grandfather? Mickey couldn't bear the long pause. Where have you been all this time? Bone, wait. Julia stopped him, seeing how her former father-in-law's shoulders shuddered and then slumped even more. Go and put the kettle on. I'm not offended by you. She turned to Paul when her son left the room. You do not owe me anything. I do. The man jumped up and paced the room. You were my son's wife, the mother of my grandson, and I abandoned you when you were having a hard time, knowing that you had no one but your aunt. It's all in the past. I came to apologize and explain why I did what I did. Anthony sat back in his chair. Ariana, she thought you were responsible for Harry's death and threatened to throw herself out the window if I had any contact with you. I tried to convince her it wasn't your fault, but she rushed to the window and jumped up on the sill. I was really scared at the time. Anyway, I loved that flighty woman, or I wouldn't have lived with her all those years ago. What happened now? Why did she change her mind? Stunned by the story, Julia was afraid that her father-in-law was jeopardizing his family life. Ariana is dead. There's no one else to forbid me to see you. If you'll allow it, of course. I'm sorry. That's when Mickey came in from the kitchen. Let's go and have some tea. Julia, I noticed you have a page open on your computer with ads for apartments for sale. Is that what I think it is? Yes, we're looking for a new place to live. With a mortgage? Without a mortgage? I've decided to sell my apartment. I can't stay there without Ariana. I'm staying with some people I know. When I sell it, I'll buy a one-room apartment, and I'd like to give you the difference. Oh, no. No. Don't even resist. I don't need that money, and I owe you for all these years. You don't owe us anything. I do. My moral convictions don't allow me to do otherwise. If I couldn't help you before, I can now. So don't resist. You look good. A familiar voice made Julia tense. Quickly pulling herself together, she leisurely turned around and smiling calmly said, Thank you. Archie, ignoring his companion, stared at Julia, searching her for any indication that she still had feelings for him. But the woman's gaze was serene, her posture relaxed. Are you alone? He ignored his girlfriend taking his arm and pulling him to leave. "Why don't you join us?" "Archie." The girl was clearly outraged. "The two of us actually wanted to have lunch." "No, thank you. I'm not alone," Julie replied with the same calm smile. At that time, Leslie came into the restaurant and, seeing her friend, waved her hand. "What did you say to our handsome lawyer that he can't take his eyes off you?" Julia sat down at the table so that she had her back to her former lover. Leslie sat across the table and saw Archie looking at Julia. She asked if his secretary was the one who made the contract with the repairmen who were going to fix our roof. "Lots of grammatical errors. I guess it must be her if he's looking at me like that." "It's okay. Let him check next time." The women laughed. Julia stroked her belly and walked around her new apartment. Everything had worked out just fine. The apartment was in the building next door to her aunt's. It was bright, spacious, with a large kitchen and a loggia. Now Julie and Bones had their own separate rooms. Thanks to Anthony's help, Julia was able to take out a mortgage for a much shorter period of time. Anthony himself settled in the apartment where Julia lived and negotiated with the landlord about the purchase. Her interesting situation did not escape the colleagues. Again, excited whispers were heard behind her back. Speculations were being made. Who was the happy father? The assumptions were the most incredible, until Leslie, in the rights of a friend, did not clarify the situation. The last love besides good memories left a gift. The reasonable question why the last love does not live with the boss was also answered. Why? In time, feelings will fade, but the household will remain. And Julia is not at the age to cloud her life with routine. She will have a child, which will remind her of a happy period in life. And there will be no tired and demanding attention and food, a man at her side. So it's true. A startled Julia turned sharply and stumbled toward Archie. Her belly literally pressed against him. "Yes, I see it. What's true and what do you see?" The woman tried to pull herself together. "That you're pregnant." "Oh, that? Yeah, it's hard to miss. Why do you want to know?" "It's my baby, isn't it?" "No, it's mine." Julia turned back to the car and was about to open the doors to get in, but Archie grabbed her arm and turned her around. "Why didn't you say anything to me?" "Why would I tell you anything? We broke up. It's over. My life is none of your business. Neither is yours to me." Julia tried to gently release her hand, but the man held it tightly. "But you're pregnant with my child. I should have known that." "Why? To persuade me to have an abortion, or what? Or to scare me into not asking you for anything? I didn't expect anything from you anyway. I just wanted to have another baby, that's all." "What would you do if you found out?" I don't know. Maybe we could work something out." "About what?" Julia laughed. "You left me for a young girl. What could you offer my child but my tears and my nerves? Money? We already have that. Care, love, and attention? I don't think so. So why did I have to tell you I was pregnant and let go of my hand? You're hurting me." At that moment, something struck Archie's back. He turned around in surprise and saw an older man swinging for another blow. "Let go of my daughter now, you rascal," he shouted and hit Archie in the chest again. "Anthony, calm down." Julia turned to him. "It's just an emotional acquaintance of mine. He's leaving now. Go away, Archie. Go on, get out. And I don't want to see you here again." Archie was sitting in his house, methodically getting drunk. Well, it wasn't his house, it was his new young wife's apartment. The man had left his apartment to his first wife and daughter. "Kitty, are you coming?" Your kitty already missed, came from the bedroom sweetly sweet and therefore very annoying voice of the young wife. How could he have gotten so lucky? What moved him when he fell for a young, half-dressed body? He had always been attracted to a woman by her mind and then her looks. What had happened when he jumped into bed like an obedient steer with that little fool? He really loved Julia, and she was his. He could see that. Yeah, he'd gotten so used to the relationship over the last couple years that he was getting bored with it. But there was something he could have done. No, he was afraid of something. Maybe if Julia had told him she was pregnant, he would have dropped everything and married her. And now he'd be happy. Slender fingers with manicured fingernails rested on his shoulders. "Kitty, are you coming soon? Why are you drinking so much? What about your kitty? Can you make her feel good with that much alcohol?" Archie patted her delicate hands lightly and took up the glass again. No, sweetheart. Tonight, your kitty will sleep in the living room in the company of a bottle of cognac. You go to the bedroom, and do me a favor and don't distract me anymore. Anthony was born right on time, a strong, healthy boy. Julia had plenty of helpers to take care of him. Every day her aunt and Anthony came to visit. Having recovered a little after childbirth and adjusted her regime with a new family member, Julia thought about going to work. Her bosses were waiting for her eagerly, and the mortgage payments, although they had become much smaller, Julia had transferred to the bank all the large payments that she was entitled to at the birth of the child, but remained as regular. At the family council, it was decided to let Julia go to work for at least half a day. Anthony was to remain under the watchful eye of Dash's aunt and Anthony during this time. Julia came back to work looking slimmer and younger, thanks to the birth of the baby and the support of her family. Julia, it's like you're back from the resort, not from maternity leave. Admiringly looking at her friend, exclaimed Leslie. Well, and you, I see, did not waste time. Julia looked meaningfully at Tanya's small, but already noticeable tummy. Yes, I decided to follow your example, but there's a little problem. Yes, what? Julia was afraid for her friend. The baby's father doesn't want me to raise him without him. Who's the father? Yes, a programmer. Ours? No, self-employed. Works from home for some state company. You'll see. He comes to meet me every day. I don't know how to get rid of him. Is he that bad? No, he's okay. Polite, good-looking, caring. He makes good money. But you know how I feel about men. I don't want to keep the family home for them. Leslie ran away, and Julia, smiling, thought, that's how it is. Earlier, she had been perplexed by her friend's position on men, but now she fully supported it. Days flew by. Julia no longer worked half a day, but all day. Her babysitters insisted on it. Why do you have to drive back and forth? You won't get anything done at work, and everything at home will be a mess. No way. Go full-time and don't worry about a thing. Anthony and I can manage on our own, and Mickey's always there for you. That was the deal. After work, Julia ran to the store, bought groceries, and hurried home. There, after taking a shower and changing her clothes, she would let her aunt go home and do the chores her aunt hadn't had time to do. Julia devoted her weekends entirely to her boys, socializing, playing, going for walks, or to caves. Sometimes she just ordered a pizza and watched cartoons with them at home. Often the aunt would join them too. On Sundays, Julia would prepare a big family dinner and, having gathered her relatives, would treat them to various delicious things. They sat at the table for a long time, talked, drank several cups of tea, and were quite satisfied with each other. How was my son? Without knocking or saying hello, Archie entered the office. Archie, have you forgotten the rules of decorum? Julia didn't even look at him, studying the papers. Don't you think I have a right to see my child? Ignoring her remark, the man continued. Your child, yes, but it's not your child. And anyway, if you don't have anything work-related to do with me, then kindly step outside. I'm very busy. Julia was still reading the papers. You have no right to. Julia never heard what she had no right to say. There was a knock on the door and a young man in work overalls came in. Hello, checking the alarm system. May I? Julia took her eyes off the paperwork and looked at the man. Yes, please. The repairman put his huge toolbox on the floor and went out again, but returned immediately, holding a stepladder. May I? He asked Archie and gave him a little push, showing him that he was standing directly under the sensor. I'm not finished. Archie exclaimed indignantly and stormed out of the office. I'm sorry for interrupting, the young man said in an apologetic tone. But, you know, it's my job and I have my own deadlines. No need to apologize. Our head of the legal department is just in a bad mood today, Julia smiled. The young man smiled back at her with a childish and disarming smile and climbed to the ceiling. All day after the repairman left, Julia thought about his smile. It was the kind of smile you don't often see on grown people. You might say, never at all. Archie had tried several more times to catch her out and claim her son. When Julie got tired of it, she threatened him with a complaint to the general and a police report. You, as a lawyer, should realize how this will end for you, so leave me alone. Julia's look at that moment was so determined that Archie realized that the woman was not joking and he really better leave her alone. But how could he? Every day he saw her walking down the corridor, attracting the stares of the male staff. A couple times he'd heard conversations between them that each of them wouldn't mind courting Julia. And some had even tried, but she had made it firmly clear that they had no plans to start any kind of relationship. Those who did were left to sigh. Archie was literally biting his elbows for having traded Julia for a young fool. How she annoyed him now. Her way of dressing now seemed vulgar rather than sexy. Her chatter was not cute and easy, but silly and annoying. Her kitty pissed Archie off to such an extent that he could barely restrain himself from hitting the girl. He began to think about divorce, but where would he go? His wife long ago met another and even, as he says, happy with him. Julia wants nothing to do with him, and even the child she gave birth to from him does not contribute to her forgiveness. Julia, in the office peak general we here decided to modernize all our alarms, so you will have to suffer some inconvenience for a while. What kind of inconvenience? Julia frowned. She didn't like to be distracted by anything or anyone at work. The presence of another sensor specialist. Julia was about to frown and hope it wouldn't take long. But then there was a knock on the office door, and the recently smiling repairman walked in. Hello! His smile made her forget her intentions to frown. And here he is, Julia. Meet John, your temporary neighbor. You can just call me John. The man smiled again. I'll try not to take advantage of your hospitality for long. Use it as long as you need. Julia smiled back, as long as the modernization of our alarm system is successful. They became friends. John turned out to be an interesting and unobtrusive conversationalist. He was able to keep quiet and cheer up in time. Every evening, Julia remembered with a smile the whole day spent with him, and in the morning she hurried to work to see him as soon as possible. Several times they went to lunch together at the nearest cafe. Every day their friendship grew and strengthened. It didn't escape Archie that Julia was spending a lot of time with John. Every time he saw them together, he gritted his teeth and clenched his fists. He couldn't bear to realize that Julia was devoting so much of her time and attention to some simple working man and not to him, Archie. If earlier he'd had some hope that the woman would stop being angry with him and want to return the relationship, but now seeing how much she enjoyed talking to this repairman, how sincerely she laughed at his jokes, that hope evaporated at the speed of light. To break the idyll, Archie conducted his own investigation into his former lover's new hobby. What he found inspired him, and as they were returning from a meeting, Archie approached Julia and said, "Did you know that your boyfriend is married and has a child?" So, the woman's reaction was not what he expected. No wonder such a kind, open and well-mannered man has a wife. That's one thing. And secondly, he's not my boyfriend, he's a good friend. Maybe you don't know, but between a man and a woman there can be friendship. Well, and thirdly, as you know, I have already connected my life with a married man. So there's nothing new for me here, and I'm not going to get depressed about it. Julia gave Archie a scornful glance and took a step closer to her office. The weekend was warm and Julia decided to go to the park with her sons. Anthony joined them. They strolled leisurely through the park. Anthony entertained Julia with stories from his youth. Mickey played catch-up with Paul. The baby was already 2 years old and was amazingly cheerful and agile. After a while, the merry foursome got hungry. It was decided to go to a cafe and have something to eat. But in the nearest expensive cafe, all the tables were occupied. What can you do on a day off? They were about to turn to leave when Julia heard, "Julia, Julia." She turned to hear a voice that sounded very familiar. John was waving at her from the far corner of the place. "Come here." They came over. John was sitting at a rather large table, and he wasn't alone. Next to him was a little girl, about 8 years old. They said hello and sat down. "This is my daughter Veronica." John looked at Julia, smiling his mind-blowing smile. She too was looking at him with all eyes, so happy to see him. They continued their time together. "Where is your wife?" Anthony inquired cautiously. He noticed at once how Julia and John looked at each other. But Julia had never told him about her relationship with this man. She had said that she had made a good friend, and her whole look showed that it was really only a friend. But today's meeting showed Paul otherwise. With an outsider's glance, he realized that friendship had nothing to do with it, even though they acted like best friends. "I don't know," John answered, and seeing Anthony's surprised look, explained that we haven't lived together for a long time. Anna is a very dedicated and busy person. She loves her work as a designer and is constantly trying to improve herself in it. Courses, exhibitions, developing new projects. 2 years after we got married, we realized that we are absolutely not suitable for each other. She can't imagine her life without movement, work, new impressions, unlike me. I'm a quieter and more domestic person. Anna is a good mother, but her family slows her down. Now she works for a very cool foreign company and tries to give her best. The management of the company does not welcome divorced or single women in its ranks, so we decided not to get divorced. For now, I, if possible, take my daughter with me so that Anna could have free time for her work. Commendable was all Anthony could reply, noticing Julia's eyes light up with hope. Julia was going home. John had finished his work today and they probably wouldn't see each other again. She'd hoped he would somehow indicate their future relationship, but the man remained silent. Well, then Julia decided, apparently our friendship had come to an expected end. Of course, she liked John very much as a man, but she did not consider such a relationship with him as an affair. Socializing was enough for her. She had decided that she would rather have a good friendship than an affair that was painful in its ending, and she had no doubt about that. Julia no longer believed in her feminine happiness. Fate had taught her 2 cruel lessons in love affairs. They walked together to the door of her office and, instead of the courtesy she had expected from John in the form of opening the door for her, he suddenly put his arms around her and pressed her against him. She didn't resist, only looked questioningly into his eyes. "Julia, I don't want to lose you." His face was so close that she could feel his agitated breath on her. "I want you to know that I care about you. Kier, I'm used to you too, and I wouldn't want us to stop talking. You have my phone number. We can go out on weekends with the kids." "That's not what I mean. I like you as a woman. I want to be with you." "John," Julia tried to gently free herself, primarily so he wouldn't notice her trembling. "We're a little different. I'm older than you. I have 2 children and not a very easy fate. Why would you do that? I really feel good about you and I want our friendship to continue." "Friendship, but no more." "Why?" "In time, if we become lovers, you'll realize that I'm not the right woman for you. I'm sure you'll do the manly thing and try not to upset me, but it will still be painful for me. And I don't want to repeat my past relationship again. If it's okay with you, let's just be friends." John looked into her eyes and she could see his regret, despair, and resistance, but he said out loud, "Okay, let's stay friends." Julia looked sadly at the spot where John's desk had recently been. Since their last meeting, he still hadn't called. Leslie peeked through the door. Her belly had grown to an impressive size. "Julia, am I interrupting?" "No, come in." Leslie came in, walked around the office a bit, and sat down across from Julia, tapping her fingers nervously on the desk. "What's wrong?" Julia looked at her friend worriedly. "You know, I went to the ultrasound." "Leslie, come on. It's a boy." "That's great. Consider it a dowry. I'll pack everything Anthony grew up with." "Thank you, but that's not what I meant. You see, I've been thinking. A boy needs a father, right? Leslie, a boy needs a good example. And who's gonna set that example? I can't say I'm a good example, but I've always tried to make Mickey see me as a good person." "Exactly. You, Julia, are a good example of that. What about me? I'm fickle and unsteady. Maybe having a baby will fix you. And if not..." Leslie drummed her fingers nervously on the table again. Julia looked at her friend carefully. She was obviously worried about more than that. There was something she wasn't telling her. But what? Suddenly it struck Julia. Leslie was trying to justify herself in something. But what? "Leslie, spit it out," she commanded her friend. She looked at her fearfully and sighing said, "You see, Carlos turned out to be very persistent. He literally does not give me a pass. Every day he picks me up from work, drives me home, buys me groceries, and knows everything about my pregnancy. Okay, so I can't figure it out. Does that freak you out or I love it? Well, what's the problem? I don't want to be a housekeeper serving my husband. Who told you that you would be? Apparently, your Carlos is going to take over all those responsibilities. And what if he doesn't? What if he's only caring right now, and then he's gonna chain me to the stove and the iron? Then you'll divorce him, but it's worth a shot. What if you like it? Maybe you'll have a wonderful family. Not all men see women as servants. There are some who take care of the family themselves. Maybe you should try it with Carlos. We could even just live together first, without signing. You're not a prude, are you? I mean, you think it's worth a shot. Leslie tried to pretend that she doubted, but her eyes showed that Julia's advice pleased and reassured her. Of course. That evening, the phone rang. "Julia, Carlos asked me out." "Oh, that's great. You should totally go." "Yeah, except I decided to torture him a little bit and told him I didn't want to see him alone yet. So he suggested that I bring a friend and he could bring a friend." "Julia, let's go, huh? You mean you want me to go out with you and keep some strange man company? Come on, Julia." "Oh, please, I can't just give up like that. If I go out alone, he's bound to charm me and I won't be able to resist, and my whole plan will be ruined." "Leslie, what plan?" "The plan that I'm willing to be with him, but only for the baby, to keep him on his toes." "Oh my gosh. Thank you, Julia. We'll pick you up at 7 o'clock tomorrow night." Leslie promptly passed out. Julia, smiling, shook her head. Well, why not help her friend out, especially since she hadn't been anywhere in a while? "Julia, isn't this great?" A satisfied Leslie was bouncing around in the car seat. "I was surprised to see John too. He and Carlos are friends. Why didn't you tell me about this?" She turned to the handsome man sitting next to her, looking at her adoringly. "Leslie, there was no way," Carlos began to say in an apologetic tone. "We've met too little. I would certainly have introduced you to all my friends if our relationship had continued." "Does Julia know John?" "Yes, so do I. Your John used to do sensors in our office." When Julia walked to the car pulling into her driveway and saw John, she thought he was here by chance on business. But then a smiling Leslie looked out the window from the back seat and waved her hand, urging Julia to get in the car. John smiled the same mesmerizing smile that had won Julia over immediately. So the evening was going to be even more pleasant than planned. "Good evening," was all Julia could say. The words stuck in her throat. She was thrilled to see John, and at the same time worried about how he would behave. All evening John kept his eyes on her, which didn't escape Leslie and Carlos. When the women went to the ladies' room to powder their noses, Leslie rushed in with a questioning look. "Julia, what's the meaning of this? John looks at you like a boy in love, and you don't seem like a pleasant conversationalist. Did something happen between you two?" "No." Julia's answer was so abrupt that Leslie was even more eager to find out. "Did she? You haven't realized you're attracted to each other yet. Or have you realized it, but you're embarrassed? Or maybe you've been trying to say it, but you've been interrupted." "Leslie, he's married." Julia rudely interrupted the flow of questions. "Yes, I didn't see a ring." "You don't have to. I just know. He also has a daughter." "Really?" "He said that with his wife they haven't lived for a long time, and they didn't divorce only because it would hurt her career." Everything can be, Leslie thought, but even if that's true, then you're right. A married man is a married man, no matter how he justifies it. Well then, be careful with him. "Thank you, Leslie, for understanding." Meanwhile, a similar conversation was going on at their table. "John, I see you have a soft spot for Julia." Carlos looked at his companion carefully. "I take it you two know each other. Was there something going on between you two?" "No." John twirled his napkin in his hands. "But I worked in her office, and that's where I met her, and I became friends with her. That's what she thinks, and I'm missing. I tried to tell her how I felt, but you can't tell from the look in her eyes that she doesn't care about you. She might, but she says she doesn't. She says we're just friends, and the fact that I'm not single repulses her. She doesn't want to date a married man." "What about Anna?" "Anna, she has a career and a strict boss. I feel like I'm caught between two fires. Maybe I should talk to her, explain the situation." "I already did. She promised that as soon as she signs the contract and goes to Europe to work, she'll try to file for divorce." "And when does she sign that contract?" "Next week." "Can I wait for you?" They pulled up to Leslie's house. Carlos got out to see her off. No need. Leslie answered instead of the man and pulled him by the arm. Carlos, happy, followed her. Leslie had decided to give Carlos a chance after all, John said and pulled away. Do you think it was worth it? Julia decided to find out from Carlos' friend the seriousness of his intentions. I don't think so. Carlos is a balanced man who has everything strictly according to plan and as it should be. He's been bothered by that way of life, but no matter how hard he tries, he can't help it. Habit. Acquaintance with Tatiana brought some turbulence into his life, which he was very happy about. Her directness and uncertainty in her actions fascinates him. He never knows what to expect from her, and that gives him variety in his life. So this her fickleness may also be the reason for their breakup. Eventually, he's gonna want stability and certainty, and I don't think Leslie can give him that. He doesn't need it. He wants his life to be filled with surprises. Even if they're not always pleasant, he wants them to keep him energized and bored. So Leslie's his entertainment? Julia, don't exaggerate. He loves her very much, and when he found out she was having a baby, he went crazy. He'd do anything to have her with him, even a return to his boring, humdrum life if Leslie wanted him to. They pulled up in front of the house. Julia got ready to get out of the car. Thank you for a lovely evening. I'll walk her out. John got out of the car too. They walked in silence to her driveway. Julia, I'd really like to see you again. The woman looked at him carefully. She was slightly offended that he hadn't even called her all this time, and now, after a chance meeting, he had decided to ask her out. Had she somehow let him know she cared about him? John, I have a lot of work to do. I'm afraid tonight's gonna put me on overtime for the rest of the week, and I've already promised the kids a trip to the country this weekend. She hadn't planned anything like that, of course, but she needed to let John know that she had her own life and wasn't very keen to let anyone else in. Julia, are you mad at me for not making myself known after we said goodbye at the office? He took her by the shoulders. I'm sorry. I wanted to figure out my family life first, or rather, the absence of it in real life and the presence of it on paper. I was making some progress, but we met before. John, I don't care what's going on in your family. I mean, I sympathize with your situation, but I thought we were friends, and you just disappeared. Maybe that's the way you think it should be. But I'm used to my friends having some kind of contact with me, at least on the phone. Then why did you call me? I did, but your phone was out of range. Julia was lying. She didn't want to call John first. After his confession, she'd hoped he would continue to try to move their friendship into a more intimate relationship. That's odd. I didn't have a message that you called me, the man muttered confusedly. Anyway, sorry. Everything I said that night is true. I care about you. I want to be with you. And not just as a friend, as a man, but you're right. I have nothing to offer you except my love. I'm dealing with the situation, and I'm willing to be your friend until it's resolved. Please don't push me away. How can I push you away if you disappear? Julia grinned. It won't happen again. Can my daughter and I go out of town with you? Yes, of course. Dasha's lie determined her plans for the weekend. Only we haven't decided where to go yet. I know the perfect place. There's a small campground, a lake, and a forest. If you want, you can go there. Great. Let's go to the campground. Then I'll call tomorrow and make reservations. Great. There was silence. There wasn't much else to say. Usually, lovers start kissing at this point, Julia thought, and said aloud, well then bye. See you this weekend. Yes, goodbye. John said goodbye, but remained standing. Julia decided to show all her friendliness to him and reached up to kiss him on the cheek. But John suddenly turned his head to meet hers, and her lips, instead of his cheek, met his. The man immediately enveloped her in his arms and began kissing her hotly. Julia wanted to push him away, but her long loneliness, their reconciliation, and his passionate impulse gave her no chance to do so. They stood kissing under the entryway canopy like first-time teenagers in love. Breathing heavily, they pulled away from each other. After a brief silence, during which John watched Julia anxiously, she laughed. That doesn't sound like a friendly goodbye kiss. The man heaved a sigh of relief. I'm sorry. I've been dreaming of this for too long. So when your lips were so close, I couldn't contain myself. Don't apologize. Julia felt light and carefree. I couldn't help it either. It's been too long since anyone kissed me. I can do it again. John smiled. No, that would be too much. Julia laughed. I gotta go. Bye. She skipped down the stairs, ran into the elevator, and pressed her fingers to her lips. It was as if she wanted to seal that kiss in her memory. John walked leisurely to this car. He sat behind the wheel and smiled. She cared about him. Then there was a chance, but first he had to deal with Anna. Julia woke up with a smile on her lips. After last night's kiss with John, she was in a great mood. She spent a long time choosing her clothes, then carefully applied her makeup and styled her hair. You've brightened our dull office like a ray of sunshine. Leslie smiled at her. Why, I wondered, did you look so happy? Wait, let me guess. You spent the night with John. I did not. Then you intrigued me. We kissed. Leslie stared at her friend in bewilderment. Are you kidding? A simple kiss doesn't make you glow like that. You're the one who's used to kissing all the time. You're used to it. I haven't had one of those in years. I've forgotten how it all happens and how it feels. Julia smiled and raised her eyes dreamily to the ceiling. Well, I want details. At that time, one of the female employees came into the office. Girls, General calls everyone to a meeting. Leslie and Julia looked at each other. Why all of a sudden? I will not keep the entry, began the director when everyone was seated. Time is money. My immediate management appreciated my work over the years and decided to promote me by transferring me to the head office. I have been instructed to choose my own replacement. In order not to offend anyone with my choice, I have selected several candidates, and the final decision will be up to you. By voting, you will choose a new general director. The head was silent and looked around at everyone present. You have 2 weeks to think about it, continued the director. Write the name of your chosen candidate on a piece of paper and throw it into this box. The director patted the box on the table. In 2 weeks, I will open it in your presence and we will see who you have chosen. Now, I'll name the candidates. Julia, you're on a white streak. Leslie was practically jumping up and down on her way back to her desk. You've got a great man and you've been nominated for general. Well, first of all, the cool man is married, and secondly, I was nominated for the general, as I think. Well, first of all, in Julia's tone, Leslie answered, Carlos said that John really does not live with his wife, and they do not divorce only because it could hurt her career. And secondly, you are a specialist in the profile of our office and know all the work from the inside. Unlike lawyers, economists, and who knows what else. And the people love you. So, I think you've got the CEO job in the bag. Well, go to work. Laughed flattered Julia. You won't feel my leadership anyway. You'll go on maternity leave. As soon as Julia entered her office, Archie came in right after her. You look lovely, he began. Archie, get to the point. I've got a lot of work to do. Julia didn't feel like talking to him, especially since he was also nominated for the general position and the woman guessed what the conversation might be about. But to her surprise, that's not where he started. I saw you with a man, or rather, with that boy who was fixing things around here. Archie tried to sound dismissive, but he was not very good at it. It's none of your business. Julia looked at him tiredly. If you wanted to talk about it, I'm sorry, I really have a lot of work to do. Do you want to show off to your superiors? The man got angry. To get a high position, you've got to support your young lover. Archie, get out. Julia was surprised by this behavior of her former lover. He'd never behaved like this before. Do you think I'm going to let some punk raise my son? Archie was getting more and more agitated. Archie, get out, or I'll call security right now, Julia said clearly, without raising her voice. What's going on here? The general entered the office. Archie, have you decided to start eliminating the competition? With threats and yelling. I didn't expect such unprofessionalism from you. Get back to work. The last contract was a bit dodgy. Julia, let's see the documents on the new device. The director turned away from Archie, signaling that the conversation was over. He reluctantly headed for the door. It was obvious he had more to say, but his career was on the line and he didn't want to risk it. John tapped his fingers nervously on the steering wheel. The traffic jam wasn't going to clear. He was afraid that he would be late for his meeting with Anna, and she would not accept his proposal. Finally, the traffic was back to normal. John increased his speed as much as he could. Anna was already waiting for him, glancing nervously at her watch. "I'm sorry." Stuck in traffic, John's heart dropped at the disgruntled look on his wife's face. "It's all gone." "Nothing." It seemed the woman's displeasure had nothing to do with him. "I certainly don't have much time, so if you don't mind, I'll start." "Okay." "Yes," sighed John. "Anyway, the thing is, my supervisor and I—" Anna hesitated. "Anyway, we're having an affair. And the other day he proposed to me." "John, I know that you and I haven't loved each other for a long time, and I'm very grateful that you haven't divorced me all these years. But now, I know you want it too, so let's divorce." "But what about your contract?" Not believing his happiness, John asked. "Oh," Anna waved her hand. "Oleszek will arrange everything as soon as we divorce." Oleszek, apparently, was Anna's new love. She was silent for a while, but John could see that she had more to say to him. With a heavy sigh, she finally made up her mind. "Here's the other thing, John. As soon as Oleszek and I get married, we're going to fly to Europe right away. Except Veronica." "What about Veronica?" John was scared. If Anna goes to live in Europe, he will not be able to see his daughter. "The thing is, I'm afraid I won't have any time at all to take care of my daughter. Can you take her for yourself?" Anna looked hopefully at her husband. "Of course." John almost jumped for joy. "Of course I'll be happy if Veronica stays with me." "Well, that's fine." The woman sighed with relief. "Then let's not waste any time. Let's get a divorce." "Did you have something to say to me?" Anna looked at John. John was thinking so much about her proposal that he was driving almost on automatic. "Hey, what?" He didn't understand. "But you're the one who insisted we meet. What did you want to talk to me about?" "Oh, yes, the same thing you wanted to talk to me about." "About the divorce?" John nodded affirmatively. "And who is she?" "What do you mean, who is she?" "Well, you've been happy for years and suddenly you want a divorce. So you have someone else." Anna explained her conclusion. "Don't get me wrong, I'm not a dog in the hay. I'm even glad you met someone. It's just that I'd like our daughter not to suffer from your infatuation. I hope she's a good person. A wonderful person." Julia sat on a low bench and admired the lake. The base turned out to be located in a beautiful scenic spot. It felt like they were in the last century. Small wooden houses on the shore of the lake, surrounded by forest. No dust, no city noise, no hustle and bustle, peace and quiet. "Shall I join you?" The girl's voice brought Julia out of her reverie. "Yes, of course." "Isn't it beautiful?" "Very." "Daddy fell in love with this place the minute he saw it." "I'm not surprised. I'm ready to stay here for good." "They're booked up for months in advance." "Really? Then how did your dad manage to get us a place?" "No surprise there. It's his base. And the cabin they put us in is his own, so it's unoccupied. But it's a lot of work to keep an eye on a base like that. He's supposed to be here all the time. And John's in town all the time, and he's doing something else entirely. That's the way it was at first. He lived on the base and kept an eye on things. But then he met my mom. So he had to hire a manager and move to the city. Mom doesn't like life outside of civilization. To keep her busy, he started repairing electronic devices. But he comes here a lot too." Julia thought about it. A new John had opened up to her. Anthony came running up, out of breath. "Mom, come on, all of us." The boys and John grilled kebabs and set up a table just outside. It was decided that since they were in the majority, the girls would be excused from housework. Julia, smiling, looked at the sleeping boys. The intoxicating forest air, food, and outdoor games literally knocked them off their feet. Even the seemingly long adult Mickey had returned to his childhood and was playing childish games along with Anthony and Veronica. Julia threw on a warm, wide scarf and stepped out into the hallway. There was no sound from the room where Veronica and John slept either. They must be asleep too, thought Julia. And no wonder. John had been busy with guests all day, in addition to his base business. After telling Julia to rest and enjoy nature, John played with the kids, grilled meat, and cut salads. Julia's path lay toward the lake. She wanted to sit in silence, look at the water, and think. John was becoming more and more fascinating to her. She didn't know how to behave with him. There seemed to be a friendship agreement between them, and the man was honoring it. No hints, no casual touches, no ambiguous glances. But she could literally feel with her whole body the way he looked at her, the way he held himself back, the way he wanted to be with her. Julia wanted to cast aside all doubts and give herself over to her feelings. But memories of her previous failed relationships kept her from doing so. It was too long to heal a wounded heart. There was someone sitting on the bench. Julia got upset and slowed her step. She looked around. There were no more benches in the neighborhood. Shaking her head, she decided she would take the path along the lake. "Can't sleep?" A familiar voice made Julia wince. The setting was too romantic to meet him like this. "John, what are you doing here?" "Probably the same as you, breathing the fresh air and admiring the lake at night. Only you're lightly dressed. It's cool from the lake." "Yes." Julia didn't know what to say. "That's all right. Come here, I'll move over. I also have a big blanket and a thermos of tea. There's enough for two." "Do you always come here like this?" The woman was surprised by such a warm kit. "Yes, even in winter." They sat, covered with one plate, and drank fragrant tea. "Tell me about yourself," John asked. "I don't think to find my life interesting." The usual fate of a lonely woman unlucky in love. And Julia, obeying some impulse, told everything about herself, how she wanted to marry, and how she realized her dream. About her early widowhood and the meeting of a new love. She even revealed the name of this first love. About how she was punished for her gullibility and the decision to have a second child without a father. And how she feels for him, John, and how afraid of that feeling. He looked her straight in the eye for a long time. It seemed to Julia that he was trying to get into her soul, and she began to mentally berate herself for her frankness. But John suddenly took her face in his hands and kissed her, lightly and gently. "I'll never hurt you," he whispered into her lips. "I'll always be there for you, no matter what happens or how you feel about me. Just trust me." John pulled away and wrapped his arms around her again, pulling her close to him. "I understand your fears, but I want to allay them. I'm not embarrassed by our age difference, especially since it's not that big. And you look much younger than your age, so 8 years between us is not noticeable at all. Anna and I are getting a divorce. Her new man will help her work out her marital status for the contract. Except Veronica stays with me. Anna can't raise her. I think that's the only thing that should drive you away." "Veronica? Push me away? Are you out of your mind?" Julia marveled. "How can a child push you away? I have two myself. And I've always dreamed of having a daughter." "Well, we have a deal," John said cheerfully. "About what?" Julia didn't understand. John got up from the bench and began to look in his pockets. Julia, puzzled, watched him. Finally, he must have found what he wanted, and looking at Julia, went down on one knee. "Julia, I realize it's too early to do this, but I'm not asking for an instant answer. Just promise me you'll think about it." He held out his hand to her with a charm ring. Julia twirled the gift ring on her finger and didn't notice the knock on the office. She promised John to think about it and accepted the jewelry. If he was really serious about her and everything he'd said to her was spoken from the heart, she would throw herself into this maelstrom one more time, the last one. Then her thoughts turned to the upcoming dinner she'd invited John and her daughter to. She wanted her aunt to look at John with her discerning eye and give her verdict. "You decided to take the plunge and take the lead." Julia was startled by a loud voice above her ear. "Don't worry, I've asked around and most of them aren't inclined to choose you." "Oh, what's that?" Julia, not yet switched from her thoughts to what Leslie was saying, stared at her perplexed. However, Tatiana was not confused in the least. "He proposed to you. And how did it happen?" "You said yes, I hope. When's the wedding?" "What wedding?" Before Julia could answer, Archie entered the office as usual without knocking. "Our Julia's getting married." If Leslie only knew to whom she was saying it. Archie's face turned red. "Wasn't it that repairman?" he asked wryly and stared at Julia angrily. "To that one," the woman said. "And he is not only a good specialist in his work, but also the owner of a luxury tourist base." "Come on, where did he get the money for such a toy?" unless he stole from one of his customers. What makes you think that? A simple laborer can't have that kind of money. Who does? Successful lawyers living in their wife's apartment or unclaimed macho men? That's what I'm saying. What can attract a young single mother with 2 children to a young and rich owner of a campground? What's going on exactly? Leslie's loud question made them think of her. What do you think you're doing, Archie? How do you talk to your colleague, and even to a woman? What right do you have to insult her fiancé? It's none of your business, Leslie. I'm not Leslie, I'm Mrs. Leslie. Leslie proudly stuck out her huge belly and went straight at the lawyer. Get out of here. We have work to do. I see your work. Archie snapped at her less confidently. I'm here for work too. Send one of your colleagues. Julia left her desk too. I have no desire to talk to you. Not work-related, not personal. We'll see about that. Don't forget, Julia, I have some rights. I'm afraid your new wife won't like those rights. Julia, what's going on? Leslie sank into a small chair beside a small table with an electric kettle on it. After Archie left, Julia went to that corner of the study and pulled cups and sweets from the nightstand. Turned on the kettle. Archie is Anthony's father, Julia said tiredly. But you said, I lied. I didn't want anyone to know how humiliating it had been to me. Julia, Leslie touched her friend. Why would you do that? I could have been there for you back then. Why don't you trust me? I do. It's just, it was so painful and hurtful and, disgusting. Promise me you won't do it again. Even if we're all dead wrong about John, I'll be the first to know if you're in trouble. Okay, cell phone rings. Julia, you have to take it. As long as it comes into your hands, don't give up your happiness. Auntie was carefully wiping up the dishes which Julia, having washed them, handed to her. It's the first time I've seen such a sincere man. That's what I mean. Aunt Julia, we have to take it. Veronica, are you eavesdropping? Julia looked reproachfully at her aunt and looked at the girl, embarrassed. No, you just didn't see me come in. I decided to help clear the table while Papa and Uncle Paul were tasting the liqueur. Auntie came rushing out of the kitchen and into the living room. Anthony, don't get carried away with the tasting. I'm not taking you home. We only had a little taste. Anthony started to defend himself. I know you're just a little bit. Auntie, Julia, who had followed her aunt into the living room, looked at her in surprise. Did I miss something? Well, we didn't want to tell you until you made up your mind about something in your life. Tell me what? Anthony proposed to me, except that his liquor doesn't seem to like it. Oh no, my dear. I just wanted John to appreciate my new recipe. Indeed, dear ladies, John decided to intervene. We did have a little taste. All right. Auntie waved her towel. Put away your sips. Now we're going to drink tea. And so, let's summarize the voting results. The CEO was shining like a shiny nickel. The candidates looked at each other. With a small 1-vote margin of victory is our head of the construction department, Julia. Let's hear it. Everyone clapped their hands together. Julia stood up from her seat, waited until the noise died down and smiled. My dear colleagues, I am very grateful for your trust, but unfortunately, I have to give up such a prestigious position. There was a murmur in the hall. Julia raised her hand, calling for silence. Let me explain. In addition to the fact that the position of CEO is very prestigious and, let's face it, well paid, it is also very responsible. I would even say, mega responsible. Moreover, it requires from the person who occupies it an irregular working schedule, long business trips, and a lot of effort. I don't want to say that I'm afraid of all of the above. I just want to share with you. I am getting married and I want to devote myself to my family, to my husband and children. So forgive me, but I think this position is more than worthy of our chief design engineer, to whom you'd have given almost as much as me your votes. There was an unimaginable uproar in the hall. Some rushed to Julia to congratulate her on her forthcoming marriage. Some shook hands with the chief engineer. Some encircled the general director who had not yet left. Only the head of the legal department turned on his heels and almost ran out of the conference room. Leslie, don't you think it's wrong for a young mom to have a blast at her friend's wedding? Julia approached her friend who was having fun. Julia, you're a prude. I'm already covered in diapers and pacifiers and diapers. Just give me one night off. I thought you said Carlos was gonna take care of the baby. Now, I'm gonna take care of my own baby. Carlos can only help me once in a while. Today is a special day. That's why I let his mom babysit. So don't stop me from reminiscing about my youth, because tomorrow I'll be a caring mom and a loving wife again. Julia, the groom has approached the women. I'd like to steal you away for a slow dance. It would be my pleasure. Julia smiled at her friend and followed her husband. They walked out into the center of the large hall of the restaurant where the wedding was being held. Anthony and his wife, Dashes on, were already dancing there. I love you, John whispered in Julia's ear. Me too, she answered and pressed her lips against his.